I'm Nathan, 31 male. I'm a prosecutor for the state of New Mexico, living in Santa Fe where I was born. My life has been a strange mix of profound love and bitter abandonment, culminating in the one place I now call home, the courtroom. This is the story of how my own parents sued me for my grandfather's entire estate and how the only thing he left them, a worn-out diary, became my only defense. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Santa Fe is a town painted in shades of terracotta and baked by a relentless sun, a place where history breathes from the adobe walls. I was born here, but the people who gave me life were never the ones who raised me. My father, Hudson Miller, had been a local legend, a basketball phenom whose towering height and magnetic smile promised a future of fame and fortune. My mother, Lainey, was his perfect counterpart, a fiercely ambitious reporter with golden hair and eyes as blue as the desert sky. They were a power couple, living a life of dizzying speed, fueled by passion and a seemingly endless river of money. I was the unexpected detour they never planned for, a problem they solved with a quiet act of desertion. The story, as my grandfather told it, was simple and brutal. When I was just a year old, they drove to my grandparents' modest home on the edge of town. They left me behind with a duffel bag of baby clothes and a hollow promise to come back soon. They never did. I was a piece of luggage they had decided was too heavy to carry on their journey. And so my world became the home of Judge David Miller and his wife Willow. Their house wasn't a mansion. It was a small, warm fortress built of love and routine, surrounded by unruly wildflowers and towering pine trees that whispered in the wind. My grandfather was a man of quiet authority. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to weigh the truth in everything they saw. He was a pillar of the New Mexico legal community, a man whose name was synonymous with integrity. He was strict, yes, but his discipline was a form of protection, a promise that as long as he was there, the chaos of the world would be kept at bay. My grandmother Willow was the heart of that fortress. She was a petite woman with a smile that could calm any storm in hands that were never still. She was always kneading dough for bread, her fingers dusted with flour, or tending to her garden, humming old folk songs that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. She taught me the simple, essential things: how to plant a sunflower seed and have faith it would grow, how to bake cornbread, and how to care for another living thing with your whole heart. My childhood was measured in these moments: the scent of baking bread in the morning and the sight of my grandfather in the evening, reading thick law books under the golden glow of a single lamp. He loved to tell me stories from his courtroom, not to brag about his victories, but to teach me a fundamental lesson. Justice, Nathan, he'd say, his voice a low rumble, isn't about winning. It's about protecting what's right, about keeping the world in balance. He taught me this lesson over an old wooden chessboard in our living room. He always let me make the first move, but never, ever let me win easily. You have to learn to fight for your position, Nathan, he'd advise, his eyes twinkling with a challenge. Think ahead, take responsibility for every move. Those games taught me more than strategy. They taught me patience and the weight of consequence. But the quiet of that house couldn't completely silence the questions that haunted me. At night, lying in my small bed, I would wonder about the two people who made me. Where were they? Why had they left? The questions piled up inside me like a cairn of smooth, heavy stones, a constant reminder that I was a puzzle piece that didn't seem to fit. When I was 7, I finally worked up the courage to ask. We were playing chess and the Santa Fe wind was rattling the windows. I clutched a pawn in my hand and looked up at my grandfather. "Grandpa, why don't my parents live with us?" He didn't flinch. He paused his move, his hand hovering over a knight, and met my gaze with a profound seriousness that treated my question with the respect it deserved. "Nathan," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "some people in this world choose to live for themselves. They chase their own joy, their own freedom. Others choose to live for something greater. Your parents chose their path, but we chose you." Those words didn't erase the sting of abandonment, but they reframed it. I wasn't an unwanted burden. I was a deliberate choice. I was loved not by obligation, but by a conscious act of devotion. I was raised by two people who had built their lives around a simple, powerful principle. You stand by what is right and you protect those you love. In the years that followed, I absorbed their lessons like the dry earth soaks up a summer rain. I was shaped by my grandfather's unshakable sense of justice and my grandmother's boundless capacity for love. I didn't know it then, but they weren't just raising a grandson. They were forging a man who would one day have to stand in a courtroom and defend their legacy against the very people who should have cherished it most. 13 years evaporated into the dry New Mexico air. At 14, I was a lanky, awkward teenager, my nose perpetually buried in one of my grandfather's law books or lost in the sea of sunflowers my grandmother cultivated. Santa Fe hadn't changed, but my world was beginning to expand, its edges growing sharper and more complicated. My grandfather was still the most respected judge in the region, a man who left the house each morning with the weight of the law settled squarely on his shoulders. But I started noticing the subtle signs of time's passage. The lines on his forehead seemed etched a little deeper, and his gaze would sometimes drift, lost in a place I couldn't follow. My grandmother Willow was still the gentle soul of our home, but a fragility had crept into her movements. She would pause for breath while weeding her garden, a hand pressed to her chest, her smile a little fainter than before. It was a quiet, creeping fatigue she tried to hide, but it was there, a shadow in the corner of my eye. I poured myself into my studies, driven by a fierce need to make them proud. Every good grade was a small offering, a token of my gratitude. My grandfather's pride was a quiet thing, shown in a nod of approval after I finally beat him at chess. "You're learning to see the whole board, Nathan," he'd say, a rare, full smile gracing his lips. Then the ghosts of my past returned. The first time my parents reappeared, it was with a loud, insistent knock that seemed to shake the peaceful foundations of our home. "Dad, open up, it's Hudson," a man's voice boomed. My grandmother's hands stilled over her dough and a flicker of worry crossed her face. My heart began to pound, not with excitement but with a primal sense of dread. I opened the door to find them standing on the porch. My father Hudson was still tall, but the charismatic fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a weary desperation. My mother Lainey was as beautiful as ever, but her beauty had a cold, brittle edge. They offered me a brief, awkward hug that felt more like a handshake. "You've gotten so big, Nathan," my mother commented, her eyes already scanning the room behind me as if assessing its value. Their visit was short and to the point. They spoke of a series of financial disasters, a bad investment, a lost endorsement, mounting debts. The conversation, steered by my mother's sharp, persuasive tone, inevitably ended with a request for a small loan. My grandfather listened in stony silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of his chair. My grandmother said nothing, her hands trembling as she poured tea. They gave them the money, not because they were convinced by their stories, but because they couldn't bear to have that fight in front of me. That visit set the pattern. They started showing up more frequently, each time with a new crisis and a renewed request for funds. Their apologies were hollow, their promises to repay transparently false. It became painfully clear that they didn't see me or my grandparents, they saw a lifeline, a bank that never closed. My father would greet me with a forced, jovial question about my life before turning to my grandfather with a hushed, urgent plea. "Dad, I swear this is the last time." It never was. I was a prop in their play, a way to soften the target before they went in for the kill. Breaking point came on a wild autumn night. The wind howled outside and my father's raised voice cut through it like a shard of glass. I had been in bed, but the argument drew me out, a moth to a flame. I crept down the hallway and listened from behind the living room door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You always think you know best, don't you?" Hudson yelled, his voice laced with years of resentment. "You sit up on your high horse and judge me, but you've never had to struggle a day in your life." My grandfather's reply was low, but it carried the immense weight of his disappointment. "Hudson, this isn't about judgment. This is about responsibility. You chose this life. You left your own son behind, and now you come back not with remorse but with demands." "Demands?" my father shot back, his voice cracking. "I'm your son, you have all this house, this money, and you'd rather hoard it than help your own blood." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I could feel my grandfather's pain as if it were my own. "I have given you everything I could, Hudson," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But it was never enough, because it isn't money you need. You came here because you were desperate, not because you missed us, not because you missed Nathan." I heard my father's sharp exhale followed by heavy, angry footsteps. The front door slammed, rattling the entire house. I remained frozen behind the door, silent tears streaming down my face. For the first time, I saw my grandfather not as an unshakable pillar of strength, but as a man deeply wounded by the one person he should have been able to count on. He wasn't just a judge, he was a father, powerless to save his own son from the prison of his selfishness. The next morning, I found him sitting on the porch, staring at the wilting sunflowers in my grandmother's garden. His face was a mask of grief, his eyes searching for an answer he knew he would never find. In that moment, watching him, I felt the profound loneliness of a man who had spent his life fighting for what was right, only to find he couldn't protect his own heart from breaking. By the time I turned 18, I was no longer a boy watching from the sidelines. I was a young man with a clear vision for my future. I would follow in my grandfather's footsteps and become a lawyer. He never pushed me toward the law, but his life was a testament to its power and its purpose. His pride was a quiet, steady presence, a hand on my shoulder after a well-played chess match or a new, challenging law book left silently on my desk. While my future was coming into focus, the light in our home was beginning to fade. My grandmother Willow was growing visibly weaker. Her cough became a constant, raspy counterpoint to the quiet rhythm of our lives. Her hands, once so strong and sure, now trembled when she lifted her teacup. She still tried to visit her garden each morning, but her efforts were short-lived, ending with her resting on a bench, fighting for breath, always offering a faint, reassuring smile. "Just a little tired, Nathan," she would say. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon finally broke on a bitter winter evening. The wind screeched outside and a familiar, aggressive knock echoed through the house. It was my father. He stood in the living room, his voice loud and demanding, a litany of his latest financial woes. My grandfather's patience, worn thin by years of disappointment, finally snapped. "Hudson, I can't," he said, his voice low and sharp with finality. "You have to stand on your own 2 feet." My father's face contorted with rage. "Family?" he scoffed. "You love the law more than you love your own son. You'd rather pass judgment on strangers than help your own blood." The accusation struck my grandfather like a physical blow. He rose from his chair, his body trembling. "How dare you?" he seethed. "I gave you everything and you threw it all away. You abandoned this family. You abandoned Nathan." My grandmother moved between them, her small frame a fragile shield. "Please," she begged, her voice frail, "no more fighting." But as she reached for my father's arm, her face went deathly pale. She gasped, clutching her chest, and her legs gave out from under her. I rushed from the hallway where I'd been listening, shouting her name. My grandfather caught her as she fell, his face a canvas of pure terror. "Willow, stay with me," he pleaded, his voice breaking. My father stood frozen for a beat, his eyes wide with shock, but it quickly hardened into something cold and distant. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, turning his back on the scene. He walked out, and the slam of the door was like a gunshot in the sudden, horrifying silence. Kneeling beside my grandmother, my hands shook so violently I could barely dial 911. "My grandma," I choked into the phone, "she's not breathing." My grandfather held her, whispering her name over and over like a desperate prayer. The man I had always seen as an immovable mountain was crumbling before my eyes, utterly helpless. The ambulance arrived, its flashing red lights painting the walls in frantic, terrifying strokes. As they wheeled her out, I grabbed my grandfather's hand. It was ice cold. At the hospital, we sat in a sterile waiting room where the clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Hours later, a doctor appeared, his face grim. "I'm so sorry," he said. "She had a massive heart attack. We did everything we could." My grandfather didn't weep. He simply nodded, his eyes vacant, as if a vital part of his soul had been extinguished. The funeral was held 3 days later. The small church was filled with people from town whose lives my grandmother had touched with her kindness. But the two people who should have been there, Hudson and Laney, were absent. A part of me, a naive, foolish part, had hoped her death would be the shock that finally woke them up. I had called them, my voice cracking with grief. "It's Grandma's funeral, please just come for her." The call went to voicemail. Their absence was the final, brutal confirmation of what I had long known: we were not their family. I stood beside her casket, watching my grandfather's silent tears trace paths down his weathered cheeks. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry, and the sight shattered me. A few weeks after the funeral, he called me into the living room. "Nathan," he said, his voice devoid of its usual strength, "I'm retiring. A man who cannot protect the person he loves most has no right to sit in judgment of others." I wanted to argue to tell him he was wrong, but the profound, unshakable grief in his eyes silenced me. He stepped down from the bench, trading his judge's robes for quiet days spent tending my grandmother's garden. He was trying to keep her memory alive, but with every wilting flower I saw him fade a little more. I became his anchor just as he had been mine. After high school, I was accepted into law school on a full scholarship. I worked multiple jobs to support myself, fueled by a relentless determination to honor the path he had laid for me. He wrote me letters on pale yellow paper, filled not with pleasantries but with lessons on justice, ethics, and the heartaches of the profession. "Justice is a journey, Nathan, not a destination," he wrote. "It will break your heart sometimes, but you are not walking it alone." Those letters were my lifeline. The day I graduated, he was there in the audience, his old suit looking a little too big on his thinning frame. But his smile, the first genuine smile I'd seen in years, lit up his face. "Your grandmother would have been so proud," he whispered as he hugged me, his eyes glistening. I came home to Santa Fe and took a job as a deputy prosecutor. My grandfather became my mentor once more. We spent our evenings discussing my cases over the old chessboard, the chipped pieces a tangible link to our shared past. He was growing weaker, his cough more persistent, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. "Being a prosecutor isn't about winning, Nathan," he reminded me constantly. "It's about protecting what's right." One morning, the house was too quiet. I found him in his armchair by the window, an open diary resting on his lap. He had passed away in his sleep, finally at peace. On the last page, in his shaky hand, he had written, "True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it." I knelt beside him, my tears falling onto the worn leather cover, and thanked him for everything. I was alone now, but I was not lost. In the wake of my grandfather's death, Santa Fe felt like a stranger. The familiar landscape, the red earth, the vast sky seemed muted, as if the town itself was in mourning. I organized his funeral, a solemn affair that drew a crowd from every corner of the state. Judges, lawyers, and clerks whose careers he had shaped stood alongside the local farmers and market vendors he had treated with equal respect. They spoke of his unwavering integrity, his compassion, and his profound impact on the community. I stood in a black suit, a hollow ache in my chest, listening to their tributes. And then my parents arrived. Hudson and Laney swept into the church, dressed in expensive, somber attire that looked more appropriate for a high society event than a funeral. My father's face was a cold, unreadable mask. My mother offered me a glance so fleeting it was insulting. They weren't there to grieve. They were there to survey their potential inheritance, their eyes scanning the crowd, calculating. The sight of them sent a surge of cold fury through me, but I clenched my fists and remained silent. This day was about honoring my grandfather, and I wouldn't allow them to tarnish it. 2 weeks later, the four of us sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Arthur Briggs, my grandfather's oldest friend and longtime lawyer. Mr. Briggs, a kind man with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, adjusted his spectacles and began to read the last will and testament of Judge David Miller. My parents leaned forward in their chairs, a predatory gleam in their eyes. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, bracing for the inevitable storm. "All of my assets," Mr. Briggs read, his voice steady, "including the house, land, stocks, and savings, totaling approximately $4 million, are bequeathed in their entirety to my grandson Nathan Miller." He paused and looked at me over his glasses before continuing to read a personal note my grandfather had included. "I entrust my estate to my grandson, as he is the only one who understands that integrity is a person's most valuable asset." The air in the room crackled with tension. I heard my mother's sharp, incredulous gasp. Mr. Briggs wasn't finished. "To my son Hudson Miller," he continued, "I leave my personal diary in the hopes that he might one day read it and understand the man I tried to be." The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. "A diary?" Hudson roared, shooting to his feet. "He left me a worthless old notebook." His face was a dark shade of crimson. He strode to the desk, snatched the leather-bound diary Mr. Briggs was holding, and hurled it to the floor. The sound of it hitting the polished wood echoed in the stunned silence. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "I'll sue. I'll drag you through the mud until you give me what's mine." He grabbed my mother by the arm, and they stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind them. A heavy silence descended. Mr. Briggs looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and disgust. "I'm so sorry, Nathan." I said nothing. I bent down, my movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the diary. The worn leather cover was warm, as if it still held the heat from my grandfather's hands. Back in the quiet, empty house that was now mine, I sat in the living room and opened the diary. My grandfather's neat, precise script filled the pages. He wrote about the law, about his love for my grandmother, and about the deep, abiding pain his son had caused him. Page after page revealed the heart of a father grappling with disappointment, a man who loved his son unconditionally but could not respect the person he had become. It was a chronicle of hope slowly turning to resignation. He knew Hudson would never change, yet he had never stopped loving him. I closed the diary, my vision blurred by tears. I understood now that my grandfather's will wasn't an act of punishment, it was an act of preservation. He wasn't just leaving me his money, he was entrusting me with his legacy. I placed the diary on the bookshelf next to his law books, a silent vow forming in my heart. I would protect what he had built. I had no idea that my parents were about to launch an all-out war, and that the diary they had so contemptuously discarded would soon become my only shield. Their lawsuit arrived a few weeks later, a formal declaration of their betrayal. The accusation was as vile as it was predictable, that I, Nathan Miller, had exerted undue influence over my grandfather, manipulating a frail, elderly man to steal an inheritance that was rightfully theirs. The local papers had a field day. "Young prosecutor sued by parents over $1 million estate." The headlines were a punch to the gut. The district attorney's office, citing the need for impartiality, placed me on temporary suspension. My colleagues offered awkward, pitying glances. In the span of a month, I had lost my grandfather, my career, and any lingering shred of hope I might have had for my parents. I was alone, preparing for a battle I never wanted to fight, against the two people who should have been on my side. The case was assigned to Judge Marcus Nolan, a man whose name resonated with my past. Over 2 decades ago, my grandfather had taken a young, impressionable me to the courthouse, where a then-clerk named Nolan had crouched down to my level. He'd smiled and said, "If you want to practice law, kid, remember this. Justice is never easy, but it's always worth the fight." Now he sat on the bench, his salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes radiating a calm authority. When our gazes met across the courtroom, I saw a flicker of recognition. He remembered the boy, but his expression remained neutral, a mask of judicial impartiality. We were no longer a clerk and a child, we were a judge and a defendant. The trial began under a suffocating cloud of tension. My parents' lawyer, a slick, polished man with the soul of a shark, painted me as a manipulative predator. He used words like opportunist and exploiter, twisting my years of devotion to my grandparents into a sinister, long-term scheme to secure their fortune. He portrayed me as a cold, calculating figure who had isolated my grandfather in his final years, taking advantage of his grief and failing health. Each accusation was a dagger, yet I forced myself to remain stoic, channeling my grandfather's courtroom demeanor. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. My testimony was concise and factual. I presented evidence of my grandfather's sharp mental state in the months leading up to his death, correspondence with his financial advisors, notes on legal articles, even a recent completed crossword puzzle. I presented the letters he had sent me during law school, letters filled with pride and wisdom, not the ramblings of a man being manipulated. I answered every question calmly and truthfully, refusing to let the proceedings devolve into a messy, emotional spectacle. This was about the truth, and I would honor my grandfather by presenting it with dignity. The turning point, as I knew it would be, was the diary. Mr. Briggs took the stand, his presence a comforting anchor of integrity in the turbulent courtroom. He testified that my grandfather had spoken to him at length about his decision, expressing profound disappointment in Hudson's life choices and unwavering faith in mine. Then Mr. Briggs opened the restored diary. I had painstakingly reattached the pages my father had torn in his rage, and read a passage aloud. His voice filled the silent room. "Hudson is my son, and a father's love is a stubborn thing, but he has chosen a path of selfishness that I cannot follow or endorse. I place my trust and my legacy in Nathan, not because of blood but because of character. He understands that justice is not a prize to be won but a principle to be lived." The words hung in the air, an irrefutable testament to my grandfather's true feelings. A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery. I risked a glance at my parents. My father's head was bowed, his hands clenched into tight fists on the table before him. For the first time, he looked not angry but ashamed. My mother stared straight ahead, her face a mask of cold fury, but a muscle twitched in her jaw. The truth had struck its target. Judge Nolan listened intently, his expression unreadable. After Mr. Briggs stepped down, the judge called for a recess to review all the evidence. As the courtroom began to empty, I saw him linger for a moment, his gaze fixed on a formal portrait of my grandfather that hung on the wall. It was a picture of him in his judicial robes, his expression stern but his eyes kind. In that brief, unguarded moment, I saw a flicker of deep emotion on Judge Nolan's face, a mixture of respect, sorrow, and the shared memories of two men who had dedicated their lives to the same fight. I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding New Mexico sun, my heart heavy but my conscience clear. I had presented the truth. The rest was out of my hands. I had done what my grandfather would have expected of me, and whatever the outcome, I had honored his memory. The days leading up to the verdict were an exercise in controlled patience. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each hour feeling like a day. I retreated to the quiet sanctuary of my grandparents' house, the silence of the rooms a stark contrast to the storm raging within me. I found myself walking through the garden, touching the leaves of the few remaining sunflowers, or sitting at the living room table, my fingers tracing the familiar contours of the old chessboard. I reread my grandfather's diary not as evidence but as a final conversation. His words were a balm to my raw nerves, a reminder that I was fighting for something far more significant than money. I was fighting for his truth. When the day of the judgment arrived, the courthouse was a circus. News vans lined the street and a crowd of curious Santa Fe residents filled the gallery. My parents sat across from me, their expensive clothes looking like costumes. Hudson's face was gaunt and tense, Lainey's eyes darted around the room, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. I sat straight, my hands resting on the defendant's table, and took a slow, deep breath. Judge Nolan entered, and an immediate hush fell over the courtroom. He took his seat, his presence commanding the room's absolute attention. He surveyed the gallery, his gaze passing over my parents before finally settling on me for a fraction of a second. Then he began to speak, his voice deep and resonant, each word carrying the full weight of the law. After a thorough review of all testimony and evidence presented, he began, "This court finds the plaintiff's claims of undue influence to be without merit. The allegations are hereby dismissed in their entirety." A collective gasp rippled through the room. He wasn't finished. The last will and testament of Judge David Miller is ruled valid and legally binding. The estate belongs to Nathan Miller. He paused, looking directly at my parents, his expression hardening. Let the record show, he added, his voice sharp and clear, that justice does not side with bloodright, it sides with truth. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over me. The invisible weight I had been carrying for months lifted and I could breathe again. My father slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, a portrait of defeat. My mother simply turned her face away, her jaw tight with a mixture of humiliation and fury. There was no triumph in my victory, only a profound and hollow sadness. This public severing of ties was not something to celebrate, it was a tragedy. As people began to file out of the courtroom, I remained seated for a moment, clutching the restored diary. I saw my father still sitting motionless, lost in his own private hell. On impulse, I stood and walked over to their table. "Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He looked up, and for the first time since this ordeal began, the anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "You should read this," I said, holding out the diary. "Really read it this time. Not to find excuses, but to understand that despite everything, he never stopped loving you." His hand trembled as he reached out and took the book from me. He didn't speak, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a surrender not to me but to the truth he had spent a lifetime running from. My mother stood rigidly beside him, refusing to meet my eyes. They turned and walked away, their shoulders slumped, disappearing through the grand courtroom doors. I stepped outside into the warm afternoon light. The sun felt good on my face. A gentle breeze rustled the papers in my hand. In the distance, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, not in judgment but in quiet approval. I had protected his legacy. Justice, in its own painful and complicated way, had been served. The lawsuit didn't just end in the courtroom. Its shockwaves rippled through the tight-knit community of Santa Fe. The local papers, which had once sensationalized my betrayal, now ran stories about the verdict, casting my parents as the villains of a sordid family drama. The town that had once celebrated Hudson as a sports hero and Laney as a glamorous reporter now viewed them with open contempt. The whispers followed them everywhere. At the farmer's market, Rosa, the flower vendor my grandmother had known for years, took my hand and said, "Your grandfather would be proud, Nathan." As for them, they shamed his name. I heard stories of shopkeepers refusing to serve my mother, of old friends of my father crossing the street to avoid him. Their social standing, which they had valued above all else, had crumbled to dust. I took no joy in their public humiliation. It was a bitter consequence of their own actions, a self-inflicted wound. I focused on rebuilding my life. I was reinstated at the district attorney's office, where my colleagues now treated me with a newfound respect. They no longer saw me as just a rookie prosecutor, but as David Miller's heir, not in wealth but in character. I poured myself into my work, immersing myself in the daily struggles and tragedies of others. Each case file was a story, and each story was a chance to apply the lessons my grandfather had taught me. Justice, he had said, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about protecting what was right. One of my first cases back was that of a young woman named Alina, charged with vandalism. She had smashed the window of a boutique, and on paper she looked like a common delinquent. But when I met her, I saw a terrified girl with red-rimmed eyes who had been relentlessly harassed by the store's owner. Her act wasn't malice, it was desperation. In court, I argued for counseling instead of jail time. When the judge agreed, Alina looked at me, her face wet with tears, and whispered, "Thank you for believing me." In that moment, I felt my grandfather's presence, a quiet nod of approval from beyond. There were other cases, each a test of my resolve. A single mother accused of welfare fraud to buy medicine for her sick child, an elderly street vendor who had defended himself against a belligerent customer. In each instance, I heard my grandfather's voice in my head, "Justice isn't just about the letter of the law, Nathan, it's about the heart." I fought for context, for understanding, for a justice tempered with compassion. One evening my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" I answered, my voice tired after a long day. A raspy, hesitant voice on the other end said, "Son." It was Hudson. My entire body went rigid. I read the diary," he stammered, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a broken fragility. "All of it. I saw what he wrote, about his love, his disappointment. He was right about everything. I was never worthy of him." The words were raw, stripped of all pretense. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Nathan," he continued, his voice cracking. "I don't deserve it, but I want a chance to start over, to maybe one day be a father." I looked out my apartment window at the lights of Santa Fe twinkling in the darkness. I thought of my grandfather, who had loved his son even when it broke his heart. I thought of my grandmother, who had taught me to care for fragile things. My own heart, I realized, was one of them. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice steady. Not yet, but I know Grandpa would be happy that you're trying. After the call ended, a profound sense of peace settled over me. Forgiveness was a distant shore, but for the first time I could see it on the horizon. My journey from the boy left behind to the man standing for justice was never about revenge. It was about inheritance, not the money or the house, but the values my grandparents had instilled in me. They taught me that family isn't defined by blood but by choice. They chose me. And I chose to honor them, not by hardening my heart against the world, but by opening it to the possibility of healing. Standing on my balcony with my grandfather's diary in my hand, I knew my path. I would continue to fight for justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the quiet, complicated corners of the human heart where the most important verdicts are delivered.